America, there is a hospital where the doors were never locked after the last patient left, and everything inside remains exactly as it was abandoned. Another, where a woman disappeared for 42 days inside an active hospital, and the permanent mark she left behind has defeated every cleaning product ever used on it. And one, where 125,000 people were treated, while thousands were buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds, while the building above them was converted into government offices. 10 hospitals, 10 stories. At least 3 will make you question everything you thought you knew about how this country treated its own people. Hi, my name is John, and this is Abandoned America. These are the 10 abandoned hospitals in America that history tried to bury and never quite could. Number 10 is the Renwick Smallpox Hospital, Roosevelt Island, New York City. Right in the middle of the East River, squeezed between Manhattan on one side and Queens on the other, there is a roofless Gothic stone ruin that has been sitting there since 1875, and most New Yorkers have never once stopped to ask what it is. If you have ever ridden the Roosevelt Island tram, you passed directly above it. You likely never looked down. What happened here in 1856 will stay with you. New York City had a smallpox crisis tearing through its poorest neighborhoods and did what powerful cities do. It moved the problem somewhere quiet. It purchased Blackwell's Island in the East River and sent everything it did not want in Manhattan there. Its prisoners, its asylum patients, its dying. That same year, architect James Renwick Jr., the very man who designed St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, completed a 100-bed hospital dedicated entirely to smallpox patients. Dr. William Sanger, the resident physician, called the building admirable. Nurses crossed the East River by ferry every single morning to care for up to 7,000 patients a year. Poor immigrants filled the lower floors. Paying patients had private rooms above. The hospital ran for 19 years, treating the sick the city could not afford to ignore. Then in 1875, the New York City Board of Health stepped in. The island had grown too crowded. The facility was overwhelmed. The board moved the entire smallpox operation to North Brother Island and locked the Renwick doors permanently. Just like that, 19 years of medicine, suffering, and survival were abandoned in a single administrative decision. But here's what nobody ever talks about. Every single stone in that building, every arch, every wall, every Gothic battlement, was laid by prison inmates from the Blackwell's Island Penitentiary, just north of the construction site. Men the city had already locked away built the place where the sick were sent to be forgotten. Then they walked back to their cells. In 1976, over 100 years later, New York City declared the ruins a protected landmark, the only landmarked ruin in the entire city. A legal promise to preserve it. Then on December 26, 2007, a section of the North Wing collapsed. It collapsed while it was a protected landmark. The city had made a promise for 40 years and kept none of it. Today, the roofless shell glows under green floodlights every single night, while the people riding the tram above look at their phones. Did you ever have a loved one admitted to a hospital the world simply forgot? The next hospital on this list was forgotten on purpose, and the people running it were counting on that silence. Number 9 is the Linda Vista Community Hospital, Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, California. Before we go any further, here is something that will surprise you. The movies Outbreak, Pearl Harbor, and End of Days were all filmed inside this building. The pilot episode of the television show ER was filmed here. Over 60 Hollywood productions used these halls, these corridors, and these rooms. But this was not a set built in a studio. This was a real hospital. A real working hospital where real people lived, suffered, and died. And the reason it ended up abandoned and available for Hollywood to film inside is one of the most painful ironies in the history of American healthcare. In December 1904, the Santa Fe Railroad opened this hospital in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles exclusively for its railway workers and their families. Architect Charles Frederick Whittlesey designed it in a beautiful Moorish revival style. The hospital had its own Jersey cows, its own chickens, and its own gardens, so that patients always had fresh milk, fresh eggs, and fresh vegetables on their plates every single day. Dr. John Brewer was among the physicians who served its early patients with pride and full resources. Nurses lived on site in a dedicated dormitory attached to the main building. It was rebuilt in 1924 in the Mission Revival style that still stands today, expanded with new wings in 1925, 1931, 1938, 1961, and 1966. For decades, it was one of the cleanest, best-run private hospitals in all of Southern California. 150 beds, full surgical services, full emergency care, serving the entire Santa Fe Railway workforce across the region. Then in 1980, the Santa Fe Railroad sold the hospital to a private managed healthcare company. The railroad was gone, the steady funding was gone, and the neighborhood around the hospital had changed dramatically. Boyle Heights by the late 1970s had become one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Gang violence was rising every year, and the people coming through Linda Vista's emergency room doors were no longer railroad workers with insurance cards. They were gunshot victims, stabbing victims, young men bleeding out on gurneys. Nearly every single one of them is uninsured. The hospital treated them anyway, every day, without turning a single person away. Then the state of California began publishing hospital death rate statistics. Linda Vista's numbers looked alarming. The death rate was high. Investigators came, reporters came. An LA Times article in 1988 raised serious questions about the quality of care. But here is what those reports never said loudly enough. Linda Vista's death rate was high because Linda Vista was treating the most critically wounded patients in all of East Los Angeles. Every better-funded hospital in the region was turning those same patients away at the door. Linda Vista was the only hospital that said yes, and the state was punishing it statistically for saying yes. Emergency services closed in 1989. The doctors left, the nurses transferred out. The funding collapsed completely. In 1991, after 86 years of continuous operation, Linda Vista Community Hospital closed its doors for the last time. The hospitals across Los Angeles that had turned away those same bleeding patients stayed open. The one that never turned anyone away lost everything. The building sat abandoned for over 20 years, long enough for Hollywood to use it in dozens of productions, until it was sold in 2011 and converted in 2015 into Hollenbeck Terrace, 97 affordable senior apartments. If you stand in front of that building today, you will see the original Mission Revival facade, restored and beautiful. There is no plaque for the patients who died there. There is no memorial for the doctors and nurses who stayed until the very end. The building survived. The story did not. Did you ever have a loved one turned away from a hospital that should have helped them? The next hospital on this list was not in a city at all. It was built far outside one, deliberately by the government, and what they did inside those walls was kept from the public for decades. If you're still watching, make sure to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment below and tell us if you know about these hospitals. Now let's continue. Number 8 is the Norwich State Hospital, Preston in Norwich, Connecticut. A psychiatric hospital built in 1904 specifically to treat the mentally ill, the criminally insane, tuberculosis patients, the chemically dependent, and the elderly who had no place else to go. Connecticut built it because its first mental institution was dangerously overcrowded, and the state had thousands of suffering people with nowhere to send them. Here is the number that will stop you before this chapter even begins. In 2009, the state of Connecticut sold 393 acres of historic land. 30 buildings, a power plant, a theater, 2 bowling alleys, underground tunnel systems, and 92 years of American psychiatric history, to the town of Preston for $1. $1 single dollar. Norwich State Hospital opened in October 1904 with just 95 patients and 1 building on the banks of the Thames River. Dr. George M. Klein was among its earliest superintendents, watching it grow from a single building into something resembling a small American city. 900 acres, over 30 buildings, its own power plant, its own bakery, its own farm, 3 separate theaters, and 2 bowling alleys. At its peak in the 1950s, 3,180 patients lived inside those walls. Nurses who served in Ward Salmon, reserved for the violently criminally insane, reported hearing screams that never fully left them. Men like Ernest Skinner, a teenager who attacked his neighbor with an axe, and Matthew Knob, who stabbed his 85-year-old grandmother with scissors, believing she was possessed, were housed here. Over 92 years of operation, hundreds of patients died within these walls, their graves marked only with numbers, not names, not a single name. On October 10, 1996, the last patients were transferred out and the doors were locked. Then came the silence. Then came the decay. Workers sent in for demolition in 2011 discovered something in a basement room nobody was prepared for. Suitcases. Dozens of patient suitcases packed, labeled with names, stacked neatly, and never collected. People had arrived at Norwich expecting to leave one day. They packed their belongings. They put their names on their bags. They waited. They never left. Their suitcases outlasted them by decades. The state then sold every acre, every building, every tunnel, and every memory for $1, and sent the town of Preston a cleanup bill costing tens of millions. Today, the administration building stands alone, fenced and silent. The Mohegan tribe now owns the land and plans to build a resort where 3,180 human beings once lived. Did you ever wonder what happened to the patients nobody came back for? The next hospital was built far outside the city, on purpose, by the United States government, and what they kept hidden inside for decades will leave you without words. Number 7 is the Glendale Hospital, Glendale, Maryland. A tuberculosis hospital built in 1934 to isolate and treat men, women, and children dying from one of the most feared diseases in American history. Tuberculosis was so terrifying that families would rather tell neighbors a sick relative had died than admit there was TB in the house. The shame was that deep. 15 miles from the United States Capitol, hidden behind chain-link fencing in Prince George's County, there are 23 buildings slowly falling apart right now. The government owns them. The government will not open them. The government will not tear them down. They simply sit there rotting on 216 acres. The architect was Nathan C. Wythe, the same man who designed the original Oval Office inside the White House. At its peak, Glendale housed 600 patients and employed 500 doctors, nurses, and staff. The Surgeon General of the United States personally called it the most up-to-date institution of its kind in the entire country. Hundreds of patients died within those walls, their bodies carried through underground tunnels connecting the buildings below ground. Then antibiotics defeated tuberculosis in the 1950s, and Glendale was repurposed for the criminally insane. In 1976, a fire inspection found that repairs would cost $23 million. The government chose to close it instead. In 1982, the hospital shut forever. When the doors locked, former patients with nowhere to go were later found by police sitting quietly in the dark inside their old rooms. Today, those 23 buildings stand behind the fence, windows broken, ivy climbing to the second floor, with police stationed outside 24 hours a day. Still standing, still condemned, still forgotten. The next hospital was not watched at all. And what people found inside those walls is the kind of thing that does not stay in the walls. Number 6 is the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital, New York Harbor, New York, built in 1902 by the United States Public Health Service to examine, quarantine, and treat sick immigrants arriving in America, carrying tuberculosis, trachoma, scarlet fever, measles, mental illness, and dozens of other contagious diseases that terrified the country. 1 in 3 Americans alive today can trace their heritage to someone who passed through Ellis Island. Most of them know the famous Great Hall. Almost none of them know what was on the other side of that island. Attached to the Immigration Hall most Americans have seen in history books, there is a second complex of 29 buildings sitting on the south side of the same island, abandoned since 1954, still standing exactly as the last person left them. Doors never locked, windows never closed. Dr. Victor Safford was among the physicians who examined thousands of arriving immigrants daily. Nurses delivered 399 babies inside those wards, many of them named after the doctors and nurses who brought them into the world. At its peak, the hospital treated over 10,000 patients from 75 different countries every single year with over 150 staff. Between 1892 and 1951, exactly 276,000 patients were admitted. 4,963 people died there. The hospital closed March 1st, 1951, as tightening immigration laws reduced patient numbers and the federal government cut funding completely. 3 years later, on November 12, 1954, the Coast Guard abandoned the island entirely without closing a single door or window. Muffin tins, soup tureens, clothing trunks, medical equipment left exactly where they sat. The famous Great Hall was restored and reopened as a celebrated national museum in 1990. The hospital where 4,963 people died was left to rot. Today, a visitor taking the hard hat tour through Save Ellis Island will find original medical instruments still sitting on the shelves and enormous photographs of immigrants pasted onto broken windows by French artist JR in 2014. Their faces looking out at the harbor where they first arrived. The next hospital treated not immigrants, but Americans who had already lost everything. And what was done to them was done with the full authority of the United States government. Number 5 is St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Washington, D.C., the first federally funded mental hospital in the United States, built in 1855 to treat the mentally ill who were being chained in jails, locked in attics, and beaten in almshouses across America. A woman named Dorothea Dix spent 20 years of her life traveling this country, documenting those horrors. She wrote the legislation. She convinced President Millard Fillmore to sign it. She personally selected 350 acres overlooking the Anacostia River in southeast Washington and watched the first building rise from the ground. Dr. Charles H. Nichols, the first superintendent, built it on sunlight, fresh air, individual rooms, and human dignity. At its peak, St. Elizabeth's housed 7,000 patients with a staff of 4,000. Over 150 years, it treated an estimated 125,000 people. Thousands are buried in unmarked graves across the campus to this day. In 2003, the West Campus closed permanently. But here is what history remembers most. After World War II, poet Ezra Pound was charged with treason for broadcasting fascist propaganda for Mussolini. Every single doctor who examined him found him completely sane. The hospital superintendent found Pound so fascinating, he arranged to have him declared mentally unfit. Not because he was ill, but because the superintendent wanted to study him. Pound was held for 13 years without trial, without conviction, and without ever being found insane. He walked free in 1958 when charges were quietly dropped. The hospital built to free the suffering became a prison for the innocent. Today, 52 buildings on the West Campus are being converted into headquarters for the Department of Homeland Security. The unmarked graves of thousands of patients remain beneath the ground of a federal office complex. No memorial exists. The next hospital was not built for criminals or poets. It was built for children. And what was done to those children for 79 years was done in a building the state called a school. Drop a comment below and tell us what you heard about these hospitals. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button. This is where it gets more interesting. Let's dive in. Number 4 is The Ridges, formerly the Athens Lunatic Asylum, Athens, Ohio. Built on January 9, 1874 on 1,000 acres of farmland to treat the mentally ill, epileptic, alcoholic, tuberculosis patients, and the broken Civil War veterans returning home with wounds no doctor had a name for yet. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, they simply called madness. Architect Levi Tucker Schofield, the same man who designed the Ohio State Reformatory, built it with long sunlit wings and fresh air on every floor. The first patient admitted was a 14-year-old girl with epilepsy. Her parents believed she was possessed by a demon. Dr. William All oversaw its earliest operations with genuine belief that dignity could heal a broken mind. By the early 1900s, it held nearly 2,000 patients across 78 buildings. Hundreds died within those walls over the decades, buried in 3 cemeteries on the grounds with numbers on their headstones instead of names. On December 1, 1978, a patient named Margaret Schilling disappeared. She was deaf, she was mute, she could not call for help. Staff searched the entire campus. Police organized a full grid search. Nobody checked the top floor of Ward N20, an abandoned, unheated wing sealed off from the rest of the building. A maintenance worker found her there on January 12, 1979. 42 days later, she was lying naked on the concrete floor. Her clothes were neatly folded beside her. She had died from exposure to the freezing Ohio winter, alone, in a hospital built so nobody would ever be left alone. When her body was removed, the decomposition had permanently bonded to the concrete floor in the exact shape of her body. Forensic scientists confirmed in 2007 that her body fat had converted to soap and chemically fused with the floor. No cleaning product has ever removed it. Not one. The stain is still there today on the floor of Ward N20, below the windows where the cold winter sun came through. No staff member was ever disciplined. The next place did not leave one person behind, it left 6,000. And a photographer who worked there during World War II decided the country needed to see exactly what that looked like. Number 3 is the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, Somerton, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Built in 1907 as a work farm to treat the mentally ill who were being warehoused in jails and prisons alongside violent criminals because Philadelphia had nowhere else to put them. In September 1945, a man named Charles Lord showed a collection of photographs to Eleanor Roosevelt. He had hidden a small camera inside his jacket and secretly taken them inside this hospital. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at those photographs and said she did not believe they were real. She said it was impossible for conditions like this to exist in a major American city. They were real. Every single one. Byberry opened with good intentions and collapsed under the weight of neglect within decades. By its peak, it held 6,100 patients, 75% over capacity. Only 180 attendants served all 6,100 of them. The American Psychiatric Association said that number was 16% of the bare minimum required. One attendant for every 400 patients. Patients slept in hallways. Raw sewage covered bathroom floors. In 1946, reporter Albert Meisel published his findings in Life magazine and compared what he saw directly to Nazi concentration camps. Those were his exact words. In June 1990, Byberry released its last 2 patients and locked the doors forever. When demolition crews arrived in 1991, they discovered $16 million worth of asbestos inside the walls. No government agency would pay to remove it. The building sat rotting and open for 16 more years. When it was finally demolished in 2006, the land became a senior housing community. The streets are named Sunflower Drive and Honeysuckle Lane. There is no marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement that 83 years of suffering happened on that ground. The next hospital did not close because of money or lawsuits. It closed because what one man was doing inside it, with an ice pick, a mallet, and a crowd watching, could no longer be hidden from the world. Number 2 is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Weston, Lewis County, West Virginia, a psychiatric hospital built between 1858 and 1881 to treat the mentally ill, the alcoholic, the epileptic, and the broken Civil War veterans this country had no other plan for. Somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, there is a building a quarter of a mile long from one end to the other, containing 2.5 miles of interior hallways, built entirely by hand from hand-cut blue sandstone. It is the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America. The second largest in the world is the Kremlin in Moscow. Architect Richard Snowden Andrews designed it with 900 windows, staggered wings, fresh air on every floor, and a working farm with dairy cows, because Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride believed that beauty itself could heal a broken mind. Construction began in 1858, was interrupted when both Union and Confederate troops used the half-built structure as a barracks, and was finally completed in 1881 at a cost of $725,000. Over $300,000 above budget. It was designed for 250 patients, 1 per room. By 1880 it held 717. By 1938 it held 1,661. By the 1950s it held 2,600, 10 times its capacity, with 4 patients crammed into rooms built for 1, sleeping in shifts on hallway floors. Over 2,000 people are buried in the cemetery on the grounds. In the early 1950s, Dr. Walter Freeman arrived. He had no formal surgical training. He developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy, hammering a metal pick through the corner of a patient's eye socket without anesthesia. moving it back and forth to destroy the front of the brain. He charged $25 per patient. He performed operations in front of watching crowds. He drove between West Virginia hospitals in a van his colleagues called the lobotomobile. 4 patients at Trans-Allegheny died directly from their lobotomies. Freeman performed this same procedure on Rosemary Kennedy at her father Joseph Kennedy's request. After which, Rosemary regressed to the mental state of a 2-year-old and was institutionalized for the rest of her life. The building, engineered to let sunlight in and restore human dignity, became a place where patients were caged, crowded floor to a room, and lobotomized for $25 in front of a crowd. Today, the building is open for public tours. The museum on the first floor displays the original ice pick Dr. Walter Freeman used, sitting in a glass case inside the same walls where he used it. The next place was built for children, and for 79 years, it was the most organized machinery of cruelty this country ever called a school. Number 1 is the Pennhurst State School and Hospital, Spring City, Chester County, Pennsylvania. Built in 1908 to treat children and adults with intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, and developmental conditions who were being locked in prisons and jails alongside violent criminals because Pennsylvania had no other place for them. In 1968, a television reporter named Bill Baldini walked into this building in Chester County and came out with 5 days of footage he called "Suffer the Little Children." When it aired on NBC 10 in Philadelphia, the switchboard lit up immediately. The front page headline the next morning read, "Pennhurst, the Shame of Pennsylvania." In 1903, the Pennsylvania legislature had discovered 2,627 disabled people warehoused in prisons and reformatories, and built Pennhurst specifically to give them something better. Construction began on 633 acres along the Schuylkill River. The institution opened November 23, 1908. Patient number 1 walked through the front door that day and never walked back out. By 1912, it held 2,800 people. By the early 1960s, over 3,200 patients lived across 32 buildings with their own railway station, farm, dairy, bakery, and power plant. Thousands lived their entire lives inside those walls and died there. But here is what will never leave you. Staff routinely removed the teeth of any patient who bit someone. This happened so often and for so many years that after the hospital closed in 1987, visitors exploring the underground tunnels were still finding human teeth scattered across the floors. Not one tooth, dozens. Human teeth pulled from people with no voice and no protection, left on the ground like debris. In 1977, federal judge Raymond Broderick ruled that conditions at Pennhurst violated the constitutional rights of every patient inside. In 1983, 9 employees were criminally indicted for beating patients, including patients in wheelchairs. The Pennsylvania legislature built Pennhurst to end cruelty. Within 40 years, it had become cruelty's most organized address. The hospital closed December 9, 1987. Today, the lower campus operates as a Halloween haunted house attraction called Pennhurst Asylum. Thousands of people buy tickets every October to walk through the same buildings where children had their teeth pulled without anesthesia. The Shame of Pennsylvania is now open for entertainment, state by state, ruin by ruin. History will never be completely forgotten. These 10 hospitals are gone. Some are rubble. Some are rotting behind fences. Some have been scrubbed clean and sold to developers who gave the streets cheerful names. But the stories do not go away just because the buildings did. Every single place on this list had real people inside it. People with names, with families, with lives that deserve better than what they got. And there are hundreds more across this country that nobody has talked about yet. If you know of an abandoned hospital, a forgotten asylum, or a closed institution in your state that deserves its own story, drop the name in the comments right now. Tell us where it is. Tell us what you remember. Tell us what you heard, because the next video starts with whatever name appears most in those comments. The stories are still out there, and as long as we are here, none of them stay buried. State by state, ruin by ruin, history will never be completely forgotten.